Good morning and welcome all you virtual people who are hearing this on a recording. Okay. We'll just get right into it. Let me share. I will point out there we go. Why is this not doing what it's supposed to? There we go. Ah, there we go. Okay. So, welcome to Sefer Melachim Take 2. The reason it's called Take 2 is because this is supposed to, theoretically, this class is supposed to pick up where last year's class left off. Last year, we started Sefer Melachim at the beginning of the year. And I had to cut it short early due to Miluim, which I hope will not happen this year. Not Miluim, but I hope not to cancel any classes this year because of Miluim. Nobody knows what, next hour is going to bring, so there you go. But I'm giving it a new look. You see, now it's blue. I think last year was purple. So now it's blue. So all of you who are here for the first time could feel like this is new, okay? For those of you who are listening to this for the first time and not a continuation, also those of you who are listening to this who were with me last year, I would like to give a little catch me up class, which is going to be pretty much what we're going to be doing today, in which we're going to backtrack not entire year, but at least the last bit just to keep you up to where we are. And this section of these classes is called A Kingdom Divided, and I want to remind you why I'm calling it A Kingdom Divided. Here we go. Esther, please feel free to speak up if you would like to do so.
Hey.
I'm trying to figure out how to get a pointer. Here we go. Okay. So the structure of Sefer Melachim, this is that you can break up any Tanachi or any literature book in any way, that's convincing. This is the one that I think is at least structurally pretty, that Rabbi Alex Israel wrote in his book on Melachim. The reason it's pretty is because, he set it up this way. It looks very symmetrical, which is also always pleasing to the eye. So let me show you what we're doing. Melachim Aleph, Melachim Bet, which is actually one book. The reason that it was broken up into two was broken up to two many centuries later than it was written, just because it was a long book. And so it was easier to break up into two. Originally, the Vulgate, the Latin translation, broke up Shmuel and Melachim into four. They were called Kings 1, Kings 2, Kings 3, Kings 4. Then they realized that Shmuel and Melachim are actually two separate books, like we explained. So Shmuel and Melachim, but each of them is split into two just for convenience. If you look at Chazal, who tell us that there are Kaf Dalet Sifrei Tanakh, Melachim is one. Okay, just like Shmuel is one, and Divrei Yamim is one, and Trei Asar is one, and Ezra and Nehemiah are also considered one. That were also split later on. Anyway, Melachim Aleph or Melachim Bet, which is one book. They both start with, this starts with and ends with the southern kingdom, meaning when we start Sefer Melachim, which is, remember, right after the end of Sefer Shmuel. In Sefer Shmuel, we left Sefer Shmuel with David being king. David unified the kingdom. In other words, all the Shvatim. He was king over all the Shvatim. So it's not really a southern kingdom. It was more like a unified kingdom. There was one kingdom, and David was king. And the beginning of Melachim talks about David's death and passing on the kingship to Shlomo. By the end of Melachim, after we go through all of this, but by the end of Melachim, the northern kingdom, after the split, has been exiled. So there is no northern kingdom, and all that's left is just the kingdom of Judea, kingdom of Yehuda, the southern kingdom. Okay. We start with King Melech Shlomo at the beginning, right? Because, well, it's David in the first chapter, but he quickly gives way to Melech Shlomo. And at the end, we hear the last few kings. They come in fairly rapid succession until the destruction of Yerushalayim and the exile. Another parallel is many of these chapters of at the beginning of the book talk about building the Beit Mikdash. Well, the end is a quick escalation to the Churban Beit HaMikdash. Sefer Melachim is a not very optimistic book. Yirmiyahu, who wrote it, was not a very cheerful guy. Probably easy to understand why, but there it is. This is a good point to say. According to Chazal, Yirmiyahu was the one who wrote Sefer Melachim. If so, he was the one who lived through at least this end part of it. And it was written from a standpoint of understanding history from a theological view. It was, here's everything that we did wrong, which made Sefer Melachim end the way it did with the Churban. So a lot of history you can obviously tell in many ways. You could choose what to tell, you could choose what not to tell, you could choose how to tell it, you could choose what viewpoint, you could choose what to emphasize, etc., etc. Sefer Melachim stresses the messages that Yirmiyahu wanted to stress, which are, if you're a good king and you listen to God, things will be okay. Once you are not a good king, and the king is representative of the people, once you are not a good king and you stray from God, and there is idolatry, and there is ben adam lechavero evils, and then we don't deserve the land and we're going to get kicked out. And Sefer Melachim is like a blueprint of how that happened along the way. Sefer Divrei Hayamim, Chronicles, which kind of parallels Melachim, not exactly. It deviates, it changes, it adds, it whatever. It's coming from a different standpoint. It's using the same more or less historical facts, but looking from after the Galut, after people came back to Israel, and its viewpoint is more encouraging, more look how wonderful Beit David is, look how wonderful the Beit Mikdash was, and don't we want all that back? And its theology is a little bit different because it's less lashing us for what we did wrong and more encouraging us how to do right so we can get back to that kind of thing. Okay, we're going to get to Divrei Hayamim on several points this year because the comparison is often very instructive.
Who wrote it?
Divrei Hayamim. Chazal tell us Anshe Knesset Hagdola, but Chazal don't tell us who Anshe Knesset Hagdola were, so that's not really helpful. That just gives us a time frame of when it was written. Ezra may have been part of that. Some opinions say Mordechai was part of that. Those are just people that we know, but they were people. But the point is, it was written after Shivat Zion. That's why that's what Anshe Knesset Hagdola teaches us, not the identities. Okay. The next parallel in Perek Yud Bet, Shlomo HaMelech is succeeded by his son Rechavam. Rechavam was not a very good diplomat, and in his days the kingdom was split. We're going to talk about that more in the next slide. So now we have two kingdoms. The parallel here at the end is that the northern kingdom is exiled. That's the end of the two kingdoms. Okay, and then we're back just to Yehuda, like we said. The middle and heavy section of Sefer Melachim is the divided kingdom, when there's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The middle of that is the stories, miraculous stories of Eliyahu and Elisha. That's the main center of Sefer Melachim, and it's bracketed by the histories. What do I mean by the histories? Sefer Melachim, like we said, is structured once the kingdom was split. It gives us a side-by-side narrative of what's happening in the northern kingdom and what's happening in the southern kingdom. Eliyahu and Elisha are pretty much in the northern kingdom, but when it gives us the side-by-side, the kings don't align exactly. In other words, the northern king and the southern king don't become inaugurated on the same day and die on the same day and are replaced in the same day, right? There's always this half. So what it does is it tells you about one king, and it kind of leads you through what happens during his kingship, sometimes in combination with what's happening in the south. And when that king dies, it tells you he died and he was replaced by whatever. And in the meantime, in the other kingdom, a new king started reigning, let's say, 16 years into the reign of the first. So it gives you kind of the back and forth. That's what I mean by the histories, okay? We got in our class last year, more or less, why is this not letting me do it? It's not letting me do it. Hold on. Let's see if now it's gonna let me. No. Okay, I did put an animation, which it doesn't like. We are more or less here. Okay, we went through the beginning, all of Malchut Shlomo, how he was elected, the whole politics around that, the good part of his reign, the bad part of his reign, his huge building projects. He built a palaces, he built a Beit HaMikdash, he built, and I'm putting it in that order on purpose. Everything was extravagant, everything was great, everything was wonderful, everything, the United Kingdom was as like the pinnacle of its strength. That was King Shlomo. And then we moved on to King Rechavam, his son. Okay. At the beginning of Rehavam's reign, the first thing that he did was he went to Shechem. Shechem is in the northern kingdom, is a stronghold of the northern kingdom. He went to Shechem to be inaugurated there, even though he was already king of the United Kingdom. It was like a what's the word for ratification, okay, of his kingship, also over the northern tribes. They were cautiously accepting. They just had one request. Your father taxed us like crazy, which he did, both in money and in manpower, for years, to support all of his building projects. And they said, just ease off the tax burden a bit. That was their request. And Rechavam famously asked for 3 days off to talk with his advisors. His advisors were either his friends who grew up with him, or the elders who represent old school, who represent wisdom, who perhaps advised Shlomo before him. And the younger group advised him, no, you need to show your strength. You need to, show that you're king. And the older one said, you should ease up. That'll help oil the process. And he not very wisely chose to listen to the first contingent. And he lost the northern kingdom. Okay. We hear parallel to the fact that he politically lost the northern kingdom. We also hear how a man named Yerovam ben Nevat, who was part of Shlomo HaMelech's workforce, he was in charge of people, he was in charge of perhaps forcefully bringing people from the northern kingdom to Miluim, part of that tax business that they didn't like. He stood up to Shlomo at some point, and therefore was a wanted criminal, fled to Egypt. When Shlomo died, he came back, and he became kind of a spokesperson for the north, and he got a nevuah. He got a nevuah from Achia HaShiloni, and Achia HaShiloni told him, because of the sins of Rechavam, because of what's going on, I will split the kingdom. You will be king over the northern kingdom, and Rechavam will be king of the southern kingdom. That's the moment of the split, and that's where we're going to jump back into our text. Okay, if it's easier for you to look at a Tanakh, feel free to do so. What I did in the next, it may be easier to look on screen because whatever, you decide what's best for you. We're going to start with Melachim Aleph Perek Yud Bet, but what I did is I took last year's PowerPoint, and I just took one section that I found like the core of the discussion of each thing that we talked about from now on, just so we could just quickly remind ourselves and move on. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is that part that as far as I got with Rechavam, where when he didn't listen. Okay, this is after he consulted with his people and made the wrong decision. And we hear like this: V'lo shama hamelech. This is Rechavam. V'lo shama hamelech el ha'am. The am here is the northern kingdom, the petitioners, right? The ones who asked him to ease the tax burden. He didn't heed them. Ki hayta siba me'im Hashem, because there was a reason, a God-given reason. Leman hakim dvaro asher diber Hashem biyad Achia HaShiloni el Yerovam ben Nevat. Okay, the reason, in order for God's word to stand, that which he told Yerovam through the prophet Achia, that the kingdom will be split and Yerovam is going to get the northern kingdom. The reason I chose this particular pasuk is because we're going to see, or at least we're going to see several times explicitly, sometimes it's implicit, but this is, again, the author, Yirmiyahu's take on the histories, what we called dual causation. Okay, and I'll just remind you about dual causation. Dual causation means God has a plan. Whatever God's plan may be, And people within that plan have free will and free choice. Somehow God's plan will happen. Okay, God will never force his plan. I mean, there are some perhaps what's it called? Was the world to the rule? Exceptions. Some exceptions, like Paro, when Paro was his free will was taken away. Okay, and that's just like the exception that proves the rule. Generally, there is free will. And the example that I always like to give about this is Yosef. Right? God told Avram, that your people are going to go down to Egypt. Okay, so somehow that has to happen, and somehow that would have happened. And when the brothers, when Yosef at the end of the story reveals himself to his brothers, he says, "Don't feel bad. It's not you who sent me here. It's God who sent me here." Okay, because God had this plan, and he sent Yosef early to Egypt in order to build up the infrastructure that will support the brothers, that will support the family, and it was all in place, right? And in a different course, when I was teaching Yosef, I pointed out that that pasuk or that take is very, very problematic, because when you tell the brothers, it wasn't you who sent me here, it was God who sent me here, even if that's true, that is exonerating the brothers from their part in it. In other words, if the brothers hadn't sold Yosef to Egypt, there would have been some other way for God to bring Yosef to Egypt. He could have wanted to buy an Egyptian, I don't know, MP3, right? Whatever. There was some way he would have made it there. It happened through the brothers' free will, free choice to have him go there. Okay. So when Yosef says it wasn't you who sent me here, it was God who sent me here. Yes, God sent him to Egypt, but it was the brothers who are responsible for it. Even if they were carrying out God's plan unwittingly, it was still the brothers who were responsible for it. Okay, that's and in a nutshell. So what we have here is a good example of that, saying God had this plan. God wanted, for some reason, God wanted Yerovam to be the king of the northern kingdoms. And somehow that would happen. The excuse or the way it played out was through Rehavam's, I don't want to denigrate a king of Israel, but his lack of political savvy. Okay, let's call it that. Okay, it was not very smart what he did. He listened to the wrong people, and he just antagonized the people, and that was terrible. Okay, so what we have here is a dual causation that we're going to see throughout. I want to pause here just for a second. Esther, anything you want to say? Melissa, anything you want to say? Okay. Did either of you know the book, Barbara Tuchman's book, The March of Folly? Okay, that is a very famous historical book. Disclosure, I have not read it, but it's like you sound very intelligent and intelligent company if you mention, oh, the March of Folly, right? And then you talk as if you know what you're talking about. Generally speaking, okay, as far as I understand, The March of Folly is a book that she wrote about leaders throughout history, till the modern age, who made stupid mistakes. And their stupid mistakes caused whatever big historical events to happen. And what's interesting about her book is, again, I'm going to read it one of these days, I promise. Don't tell anybody I haven't yet. But from what I understand about the mistake, what's interesting about this book is that in each case, she shows how, not hindsight, but at the time, they should have known better. It's not they made a bad mistake. Oh, I should have, that was wrong. At the time, she shows how the mistake could have been avoided, should have been avoided, and they should have known better. And her first example is Rechavam. Okay, so she brings this as an example of a king who really, like, no offense, this was stupid. Okay, you should have known better. That's not to say that had he done something different, then the kingdom wouldn't have split. Would have split anyway, because we hear that that's what God wanted, okay? But the reason I'm bringing up Barbara Tuchman's March of Folly is because there's a book by Amotz Asael that was written 6-7 years ago, something like that, I remember, maybe more, called The Jewish March of Folly. And of course, you also the Jewish March of Folly, Mitzvah Ve'Velat HaYehudi, which she also does that, similar, like he's obviously taking off her idea. And he's starting from Moshe Rabbeinu. He obviously also reaches Rechavam. And his take on the book, which I think is important to mention because he wrote this way before the war. and way before the 2021, 22, 23 things that were happening in the country before the war. So it's interesting that he wrote that. But as far as I got, I'm not through this book yet. But as far as I got in this book, his main thing is we are stupid as a people for always letting ourselves be divided. And here's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. House divided itself against itself cannot stand. You know that quote. Esther, do you know where that quote is from? Lincoln did not invent it.
Where it was from, no.
Okay, so you can look it up later because this is a Matan Shir, so I'm not going to tell you where it's from. You can look it up later. House divided against itself cannot stand. But let's attribute it to Lincoln for the time being, okay? And I think that we're seeing that right in our day. We're seeing that sadly how strong we are when we are united, and how less strong we are when we are divided. But one of the things that he points out, which also a different book that I read, Shevet Achim, which I recently had pointed out, if you look at Jewish history, we like to, or we tend to, or like to, or want to look at Jewish history as we are one people that for some reason tend to be divided. Every once in a while it flares up. For example, here it flares up, now the kingdom is going to be split. And what I've recently come to realize through reading some stuff, or at least the way the stuff that I've been reading is representing it, we are a divided people. Every once in a while, we get some sort of leadership or some sort of trauma or some sort of something that forces us to unite. And when that happens, it's wonderful, right? But the natural state of being, for whatever reason, is that we are divided. And if you look at even this, right? If you look at Sefer Melachim, which was our first independent rule over ourselves, the first kingdom, the first temple, the first whatever, all this is we were split, right? We weren't split for the days of King Solomon, which were 11 prakim, but how long did he reign? And by the end, there was no northern kingdom. So basically, we were unified, the 33 years of David, after he moved to Shalim from Hebron, 33 years of David and several years of Shlomo, and that was it, right? And I think that we're going to see throughout Sefer Melachim again and again how the fact that when we're split, we're weaker. And that's when the enemies come, and that's when they know how to pick on us, and that's when things fall apart. And when, for some reason, every once in a while, there are some times when the Northern Kingdom, the Southern Kingdom managed to unify, that's a better period for us. Okay, so here we have that was the story of Rechavam. What I wanted to say about Rechavam. Okay, the next thing I want to hear. Let me just read another pasuk about Yerovam. Vayhi kishma kol Yisrael kishav Yerovam, when they hear that he came back from Egypt. Vayishlechu v'yikru oto el ha'edah. The northern people, the people from the north, brought him back from Egypt. They heard he came back from Egypt, and they called and they yamlichu to al kol Yisrael. They made him king over all of Israel. Velo haya achrei Beit David zulati shevet Yehuda levado. This is the moment of the split itself, the technical split, the moment where the northern kingdom made Yerovam ben Nevat king over them, and all that was left to Beit David was Shevet Yehuda. That's not technically correct, because we know that we know earlier already from Sefer Shoftim that Shimon kind of blended into Yehuda. Their nachalot were close enough that they just became one big mish. So Shimon was part of Shevet Yehuda, and we know that Leviim were all over Israel. So there were a lot of Leviim, Kohanim, also in the Mikdash, in Yerushalayim, and Shevet Yehuda. We also know that Binyamin, who was the border between the north and the south, and the Beit HaMikdash was technically in Binyamin, they also were kind of split alive. Binyamin is a really interesting Shevet, because on the one hand, he's traditionally, the whole split traditionally start with Rachel and Leah, right? Bnei Rachel, Bnei Leah, that whole jealousy thing. So Binyamin is technically Yosef's brother, Bnei Rachel. So on the one hand, he should be totally loyal to Bnei Rachel and to the northern kingdom, right? Because the northern kingdom is just Yosef, it's just Ephraim, right? That's the main. And then the others joined, but the mainstay of the northern kingdoms is Ephraim, as opposed to not as opposed to at the end of the story, at the end of the brothers Yosef story, right? When Binyamin is taken and hostage and whatever, and it's Yehuda who comes and says, "Take me instead," right? And that helps unify the Shvatim, right? But Yehuda kind of takes patronage over Binyamin and says, you know, I'm taking responsibility. I'm his big brother. I'm gonna whatever, and maybe that. Or maybe later on, Binyamin was also somewhat beholden to Yehuda. So Binyamin was really a good shevet. It was also the youngest shevet, so kind of the baby brother. You know, you get the impression that they didn't really enter any of these quarrels. They were a good shevet to be a mediator. Okay, so they were also. So it's not really shevet Yehuda. It's Yehuda and Shimon and part of Levi and then somewhat Binyamin and whatever. But for the title, right? For the title purpose, it's just shevet Yehuda. Okay, Yehuda is a southern kingdom, and for now on we have a northern. Okay. We hear that Yerovam became king, and he realized that if there is a one Beit Mikdash in Yerushalayim, then people, religious people, who people were back then, will have to come to Yerushalayim to do their religious stuff, right? 3 times a year, lefachot on the regalim, plus any other korban they're going to have to bring, etc., etc. When you have a center that's that religiously strong and prominent, that's also going to become the political mainstay. And Yerovam wasn't going to have any of that, right? So he had to come up with some way to kind of defer that center away from Beit HaMikdash. And there was a whole interesting thing that we learned last year about how he did it. Rather, what he did technically was he made 2 religious centers, one all the way north in the Golan in Dan, until Dan, one near the southern part of his kingdom in Beit El, and he put calves, right, agalim, and those became the 2 shrines, and symbolically it was something like Beit HaMikdash is the one center, but and you have to go there, but in our kingdom, right, you have the north and the south, that kind of encompasses everything, and he made, instead of having only the Levim, the Kohanim serve, it was open to everybody. He invented this new religion, and we saw how, and I thought this was fascinating, we saw how he was very, very convincing to make it sound like, oh, he is the authentic Judaism. Okay, and so people kind of went along with it. Okay, and we have here, Vayas Yerovam Chag b'chodesh hashmini b'chamisha yom l'chag. He made a chag in the 8th month, that being Cheshvan instead of Tishrei. On the 15th, that would be Sukkot, right? So instead of making Sukkot back when it was, Sukkot will be 2 weeks from now. He invented this, etc. Kachag asher b'Yehuda, the same holidays, the same religion, that was very, very convincing. Vayal halamizbeach. Okay, he made a mizbeach in Beit El, and that's where he did his sacrifices. Ken asa bebeit El lezabeach la'agalim asher asa, ve'amid bebeit El et kohanei abamot asher asa. Okay, so we have here in Beit El agalim, these calves, these images, and he had his own kohanei bamot. Just a short note on bamot. Bamot are high places, places which are made for sacrificing. And there's a whole long parak in, I think it's Vachim in the Mishnah, about these bamot, where before they had the Mishkan and the Midbar, if somebody wanted to bring a sacrifice, you could bring whatever. Once they had the Mishkan, you can only bring the Mishkan. When the Mishkan came to Israel and it was not anywhere specific, you can have bamot, you could sacrifice whenever you want. Once it became in Shiloh and they established it as a center, you can only sacrifice at that center. Once Shiloh was destroyed, you can again sacrifice anywhere, then right, etc., etc., etc. And the bottom line is, once you have a Beit HaMikdash, you can only sacrifice in Beit HaMikdash. even if it's destroyed, there is no longer any option to do bamot. Right? Till then, till the Beit HaMikdash, if you had a center, you had to use it. If you didn't have a center, you could do whatever you want. I mean, wherever you want. Once you had a Beit HaMikdash, even if it no longer exists, bamot are illegitimate. Okay? So what we have here are bamot that are illegitimate. We went through several discussions last year over whether this was avodah zarah or not. My take on it is that it was not, and I brought a few proofs for that. The agalim, were not the gods. Okay, it was just sort of visual. It's puzzle. It's illegitimate. It's usur. It's everything you want bad in the book except for idolatry. Okay, they were worshiping, I believe, the God of Israel in a very wrong way. I mean, obviously wrong. They obviously even picked the wrong date. Okay, but this was not, I think, avodah zarah, and I'm not going to keep saying I think. I'm just going to put that out there as a fact. And if you want to challenge me on that, we can go back to last year. Okay, so this was not idolatry, but it was wrong. It was bad. Okay, and bamot are bad. Oh, we also had this discussion. How is it possible to have, or is it theoretically possible to have one center, only Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, and yet have two political centers, one in the north and one in the south? In other words, so to speak, what was God thinking? How did Achia Shiloni expect, or God expect this to play out where there's a legitimate northern kingdom, right? Yerovam did not seize the throne. He was given it by God through Achia. That was totally legitimate. So we have a legitimate northern kingdom. We have a legitimate southern kingdom. How is that supposed to work when you only had a religious center in the south? We came up with several ideas. I don't know if any of them would have held if there aren't any convincing. But in any case, what we have now is the two separate. Now we have a case on this fake Sukkot that he made on 15 of Cheshvan. Asher bada milibo, the chag that he made up, bada milibo, invented. Vayas chag l'Yisrael, and he made this holiday. And then Perek Yud Gimel is that long and really odd story, if you remember, of the Navi Sheker who first there was a Navi Emet. We're going to see this in a minute. The Navi Emet tried to tell off Yerovam for doing what he was doing, and then other Navi came, a Navi Sheker, and it was a whole convoluted story about the upshot of which was, Yerovam, you're not legitimate. Okay, there was a whole story, remember, with the lion and the donkey, and it was very odd. Okay, we're not going to go through the whole story again. I just want to show you the main message of the story. V'hinei ish Elohim ba miYehuda. Okay, a Navi comes at the time when, Bidvar Hashem, right? We hear that he is God sent. This is a legitimate ish Elohim, the legitimate Navi. El Bet El, and he comes to Beit El. Exactly at the time that Yerovam omed al mizbeach laktir. Right? We have another problem here, right? Yerovam is not a Kohen, but as king, he took for himself the authority to do korbanot, specifically lehaktir, the mizbeach ktoret. Ktoret comes up several times as when kings decide to take something upon themselves. They usually don't do the blood and the gore. They do the ktoret, which is nice incense, right? Uziel also did, and that was also bad at the time. All right. Ktoret also has other symbolic meanings. Ktoret is what you do in order to break down the barrier between you and God. Once you do Ktoret, then the Kohen HaGadol can go into Kodesh Kodashim, right? Whatever symbolism it has. Yerovam is about to do this sacrificial, illegitimate act. And the Ish Elohim comes, Vaikra al HaMizbeach. In other words, he's coming with a nevuah, and his nevuah is not addressed to King Yerovam, possibly because King Yerovam is a legitimate king. He was put there by God. He was put there by Achia, right? However, what he's doing is illegitimate, and his mizbeach and his religious centers, that's what's illegitimate. So the nevuah is called out al hamizbeach, against the mizbeach, right? Visualize the Ish Elohim who's coming, and he's not turning to the king. He's addressing this altar. Vayikra HaMizbeach b'dvar Hashem, vayomer mizbeach mizbeach. Right? This is how he addresses the mizbeach, and he says, Ko amar Hashem, Hine ven nolad leven David Yoshiyahu shmo. One of these days, the dynasty of the southern kingdom of Beit David, which is the real, right, the real dynasty. One of these days, there will be a son to this dynasty. His name is going to be Yoshiyahu. We already know about Yoshiyahu because we read further in the book, but let's pretend we didn't. וזבח עליך את כהני הבמות המקטרים עליך, ועצמות אדם ישרפו עליך. What does he say this Yoshiyahu is going to do? He's going to sacrifice upon you, the Mizbeach. He's talking to the Mizbeach. He's going to sacrifice upon you the Kohanim of these Bamot that are serving in this stupid temple. And Atzmot Adam Yisrafu Alecha. Human bones will be burned on you. Not only that, V'natan bayom ahu mofet, he's going to give a sign, this Yoshiyahu, Lemor, Zeh mofet asher diber Hashem. This is the sign that God has given. Hine hamizbeach nikrav nishpach hadesh asher alav. Sorry, the mofet, right? He's going to give a mofet. And he says, here is the mizbeach is going to break open and everything is going to spill out. Okay. So we do know at the end of Melachim Bet, or near the end of Melachim Bet, at some point Yoshiyahu comes to Beit El, the king, and he sees the Mizbeach, and he sees markers of graves, and he says, what are these? And he's told, this is the Mizbeach that Yerovam did, and he says, exhume the bodies from these graves, which are probably the Kohanim who worked here, and burn them on the Mizbeach. Right, so at one, it's like a 3-in-1. Right, first of all, he's fulfilling this nevuah. Second of all, he's punishing. I mean, they're dead already, but he's punishing the Kohanim that worked here. And third of all, he's making the mizbeach itself tameh, so that it can never be reused. Okay, the reason why, one of the reasons why I think that that Beit El was not avodah zarah, it was just illegitimate, is because we had righteous kings before Yoshiyahu who got rid of all the avodah zarah in the land for whatever time period, but apparently this mizbeach still stood. So apparently this mizbeach was not considered idolatry, right? Otherwise it would have been destroyed with all the others. So the fact that this mizbeach survived until Yoshiyahu's time may be a clue to the fact that it wasn't avodah zarah, it was just illegitimate, and now he's getting rid of this too.
But what happened to the sister Mizbeach?
In Tel Dan, we don't hear about it. But if you go to the Golan, I believe you can see remnants of it.
You don't hear about it, whether it was destroyed or not when, okay.
But I think we could still see it standing today if we go to Tel Dan. Okay. Here, sort of, I don't know if this answers your question or not, but Rashi says, why does he say Mizbeach, Mizbeach? Which is not a question, right? He says Abraham, Abraham, and whatever. But Rashi says Mizbeach, Mizbeach, Shebe Beit El v'Shebe Dan. He's talking about two Mizbeachs. But later on, when we hear the story about Yoshiyahu, we only hear about it in Beit El. Okay. Then the parak goes on with the Navi Sheker. Okay, then we have the next parak. At some point, Yerovam dies. Sorry, I take that back. Strike that from the record. Cut that off. Okay, he's not dead yet. Okay, he has a son named Aviyah. Be'etahi chala Aviyah ben Yerovam. You're sick. What do you do when you're sick? First of all, you want to find out, is he going to, sickness in Tanakh usually means something serious, not he had a cold. Okay, and you want to know if he's going to survive this or not. So you go to whoever knows, and who knows the Navi. Okay. Vayomer Yerovam liishto, kumina v'ishtanet. He tells his wife to masquerade in some way. V'alach Shiloh, and go to Shiloh, the center. Hinei sham Achiyah hanavi, hu diber alay lemelech ala amazeh. Okay, so he knows that Achiyah hanavi is a navi emet. How does he know that? Because he says himself, Achiyah was the one who said, I'm going to be king, and lo and behold, I was king. That's kind of odd. So he trusts this Aviyah. On the other hand, he doesn't really trust him because he's saying hishtanet. In other words, masquerade, so nobody will know who you are. Maybe he means nobody will see you on the way and know who you are. Maybe he means to also fool Aviyah, which is kind of odd because he's a Navi. And even if he's blind, the story tells us he obviously knew who he was. One of the reasons we saw last year for Hishtanet, maybe so people on the way won't see you because God doesn't like me. Okay. Hi, Jill. We have Jill. Okay. And he gets to Achia, who obviously knows who he is right away because God spoke to him before, and he says, "Oh, you did all the horrible things that you did." Lechi Emri, he sends the wife as a messenger to her husband, the king, Yerovam. Ko Amar Hashem Elohei Israel, and here comes the nevuah. And the nevuah starts with, because you made the agalim, and because you made them everything, all the illegitimate, and because all the bad things that you did. Yerovam ben Nevat later becomes the gold standard for evil kings, right? Everybody's measured up. Everybody's as bad as Yerovam, or not as bad, or almost as bad as Yerovam, right? He becomes the symbol of evil of the northern kingdoms. And because you did all this, Vatara la'asot mikol asher hayu lefanecha, and you did more evil than all the other kings before you. That's very interesting, but we're going to get back to that in a minute. This is the one argument for those who think that Beit El and Dan were Avodah Zarah, but there's ways to explain this also. Because you abandoned me, says God. Lachen, and now comes the nevuah. Hineni mevi ra'a el beit Yerovam, v'ichrati liYerovam mashtin bakir atzur v'azov Israel. I'm going to destroy your entire dynasty, he tells Yerovam. Okay, and he goes on with this horrible thing. I just want to talk about this for a minute. What do you mean he was worse than everybody who was before you? That's kind of odd, especially because
there was nobody before
because
him.
there was nobody before him, right? He's the first king. And I think it's because he was because of the structure, the way Sefer Melachim has this formula. It's very formula. He has all these things that it always repeats. And one of the things, for example, it's going to say about future kings that did have kings before them. Because you were worse than all the ones before you, or because you were almost as bad as all the ones, because you weren't as bad, right? So they're going to be this comparison to previous kings throughout the book. So this is just buying into the formula.
Unless he's comparing it to David and Shlomo.
Maybe, except David is the good standard. So you can't compare somebody bad to David. Right? You're going to say you weren't as good as David, but you're not going to say you were even worse than David, right? Maybe even worse than Shlomo. I don't know, because Shlomo had maybe. Okay. And the other formulaic thing that we have here, I'm bringing this just to reintroduce the formula, is the end. V'yeter divrei Yerovam, after it gives us the whole thing. V'yeter divrei Yerovam, asher nilcham, v'asher malach, and all the rest of the deeds of Yerovam, who was at war, who fought, and who was king, who reigned, which means that we don't have all these stories. In other words, there's a lot of stories about Yerovam and all the rest of the kings who are going to fall into this formula that are not written. But Sefer Melachim is only going to bring us the things that are important for Sefer Melachim to bring us. That doesn't mean that's everything that happened, right? Throughout his years, Yerovam did a lot. Maybe some of them were good. I don't know. A lot of them were, he had stuff, and they're not mentioned. If you want to read about them, tells the author, all the rest of them, Hinam Ktuvim al Sefer Divrei Hayamim L'Melchei Israel. You can go look up the book of Divrei Hayamim L'Melchei Israel. You can't really, because we don't have that book. This is not our Divrei Hayamim. Our Divrei Hayamim is certainly not L'Melchei Israel, because it almost never mentions Divrei Israel. It's written from a Yehuda perspective. But apparently there was a book called Sifrei. Makes sense, right? The royal histories of the northern kingdom. Tanakh mentions more than one book that we don't have. We have mentions of Sefer HaYashar and Sefer Milchamot Hashem, and there are other books that are mentioned. Sadly, we don't have them. Maybe one day we'll find this book, and then we can read everything else that Yerovam did. But as far as Melachim, Melachim took the parts that he wanted to know about Yerovam and tell us about them. Vayamim asher malach Yerovam 22 shana, right? And through all those 22 years, all we heard was the beginning when he made that new religion and this story and basically nothing else. Vayishkav im avotav. This is also important as part of the formula. Vayishkav im avotav, that he was put to rest with his forefathers, is a it's respect. It's out of respect, because if you're not, if you have a king who is buried in the field, let's say, that shows you something else. So this is just the formulaic. Yes, he was buried in the royal tomb, even though his fathers were not a royal anything. Okay, Nevat was a nobody that we know of. Vayimloch Nadav beno tachtav. Okay, just because we have both of them on the same slide, I also want to mention, which connected back to that discussion of how he saw himself as not creating a new religion, not a reformer, right? But as Lachzira Tara Yoshna, he's actually bringing restoration. He's bringing back the old religion, and one of the ways
Nadav and Avihu
is right. It hints at Nadav, his son, and Aviyah, his son, which is kind of a right, like a echo of Nadav Avihu, who are Aaron's sons, right? That was the real religion before we broke up into this Moshe stuff, right? But Aaron, that was the real religion, and we talked about that too. Yafeh. Okay. Anything else? Move on. Okay. Now that we heard, remember we said we're doing the parallel one king. We hear them, and then we move. We're going to have to backtrack a little bit, okay, to where the other king, the parallel king, started. And here we have Rechavam ben Shlomo Malach Yehuda. We know that Rechavam was king, right? Rechavam was king before Yerovam was king. Now we're backtracking to, the camera is panning to the southern kingdom, and now we're tracking the southern king. Rechavam ben Shlomo Malach beYehuda. Okay, this is the southern kingdom. Vaya'as Yehuda hara b'einei Hashem, vayikanu to mikol asher asu avotam b'chatotam asher chat'u. Okay, we hear that the people, Yehuda, are sinning. Okay, there's a lot of superlatives. Bikol asher asu, just like Yerovam was worse than all the kings beforehand. Now the people are doing, worse than all the sins in there. Right? There's a lot of just make it sound bigger, right? Mikol asher asu, but these people sinned. What did they do? Vayivnu gam hem alahem bamot umatzevot ve'asherim. Al kol giva gvoha v'tachat kol etz ra'anan. Okay, bamot we know could be. I mean, they're high places for sacrificing, which could be sacrifices to God, which would make them legitimate religion, illegitimate how you're doing it. Okay, the main reason for building bamot is convenience, right? Because if you live in Tzfat and you want to bring a korban todah, you're not like, you don't want to schlep to Yerushalayim. But even if you live in Beit Shemesh, you may not want to schlep to Yerushalayim for something. So build a bama. Let's have a central, like what? It's like a shul, right? So maybe. But then we have, and I don't know what matzavot are, but asherim, that's already idolatry. And kol giva gvoha v'tachat kol etz ra'anan is also an expression everywhere, right? Every hill, under every tree, that's also an expression that's very often connected to idolatry. So you can't really slip this one by. These people were doing avodah zarah. Okay, we're talking about Yehuda. People.
So they were worse than the northern kingdom.
Perhaps. As far as
the northern kingdom doesn't mention idol worship.
Not yet. Right. V'gam kadesh haya ba'aretz. That's another illegitimate religious ritual. Asu kechol hato'evot hagoim asher horish Hashem mipnei bnei Israel. They were Canaanites. They acted as Canaanites. They acted just like the peoples who God kicked out so we can get this country. And I think that's a way of saying, well, why did God kick them out so we can get this country? Because of the To'evot, right? Because Israel, as a holy land, as God's land, cannot support this kind of behavior, right? Maybe you can do avodah zarah in China and in Indonesia and in India. Okay, that's bad, but whatever. But Israel does not tolerate such a thing. So the Canaanites got kicked out. There's a good hint of that, I think, in Brit Ben Abtarim, when God tells Avram, "Yodoa teda ki ger yeh zaracha ba'aretz olahem ve'avadu ve'alinotam 400 shana," right? You should know that your children are going to be slaves in a foreign land for 400, but not yet. Why not yet? Ki lo shalem avon ha'emori. In other words, the Amorites, one of the Canaanite nations who lived in Israel, their sin is not yet complete. They have not yet reached the part where I have to kick them out. In other words, there seems to be some sort of assumption that Eretz Yisrael can tolerate a certain amount of idolatry, but once you pass that, it's gonna vomit, as the Tanakh tells us, it's going to vomit its inhabitants. So it vomited out its inhabitants, the Canaanites, so that we can inherit it, right? But here we already have a hint that if we are replacing these idolatrous residents by being idolatrous residents ourselves, it's only a matter of time before we too will be kicked out. So again, we're really not deep into Sefer Melachim yet, and we get these constant little red lights from the author that tells us, and by the way, this is where it's going. Okay, so we should not be surprised at the end. Okay. Vayhi b'shana hachamishit lemelech Rechavam, and this is just a historical fact, but not just a historical fact. And during the 5th year of his reign, Allah Shishak Melech Yerushalayim, Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, Shishak, rose up against Yerushalayim. Vayikach et otzrot Beit Hashem, and he took all the treasures from the Beit HaMikdash, ve'et otzrot Beit HaMelech, and all the treasures from the king's palace. Ve'et hakol lakach, he took everything. Vayikach et kol maginei hazahav asher asa Shlomo, and all the gold he took. He took and took and took and took. And I want to say a few things about this. First of all, it's really sad that Shlomo, we heard back then in the first 11 prakim, how Shlomo built up his kingdom, and his kingdom was exemplary, and his kingdom was a light unto the nations, and the queen of Sheba came and said how wonderful it is, and everybody was in awe, and everybody paid tribute to Melech Shlomo, and we were an empire. And 5 years after Shlomo died, right, his treasuries are already, some king comes and he takes whatever he wants and he leaves. You don't even get the impression that there was a war. I mean, there was a war, but you don't get an impression that there was a war. You get an impression that this king is so weak that anybody can come and do this. Okay, and now I want to go a little bit back to the dual causality and ask, okay, so why was this king so weak? So you could say, yes, personality-wise, he was so weak. Fine, but if we look at how he started his reign, I think you could see two things. First of all, he was weak because politically he was weak, right? And if you look at politically weak, then what you have is a kingdom, Yehuda, who is estranged from the north. Now, the king of Yehuda, all of the kingdom of, all of Medinat Israel, as Trump liked to point out, if you take a pen and you go like that, that's how much it is. Now, if you take that and you remove everything except for Yehuda, that's not much to stand up against Egypt. Maybe if they had the northern allies, maybe if they were the whole, political empire they were before. But I'm going to say once again, even though we didn't say it before, because I'm going to keep saying it, but once again, to be formulaic, once again, we see that when we are a house divided, we cannot stand. Okay, so he didn't take over Yerushalayim. We don't hear anything. We just hear that he came and took. But the second thing I want to say is that this also can be perceived as a punishment, right? When bad things happen, Tanakh, that usually means that God is punishing whoever for doing something bad, right? What is it that was doing something bad? We'll see that in a second. I just want to finish the formula here. V'yeter, you know what? Let's say it anyway. We saw here, it's very strange. I updated my whole thing and it didn't update. We hear here that Vayas Yehuda Harabin. We don't hear that Rechavam did anything bad. Okay, we don't know if Rechavam was an idolater. We don't have any indication that he was. But similar to Shlomo, who we also said at the time, right? We also blamed Shlomo at the time for all the foreign temples, the idolatrous temples that were built in Yerushalayim using Arnona and using Misim for his princesses, for his wives, for their idols. And we said that the problem was not so much that he served these idols, but that he enabled it. He was king. As king, you could say, no, you are not building a temple to, Kamosh in my backyard, but he didn't. And not only he didn't stop it, but apparently he paid for it, right? So whether or not he himself, Shlomo, was an idolater, at that point becomes irrelevant, right? As king, you were responsible for putting a stop to this. And I think here also, right? When we hear Yehuda, maybe like Esther said, being even worse than the northern kingdom, right? That's on the king. The king is the one who's supposed to stop this. Okay, so if he did not stop that, then this is punishment, okay, against the kingdom. Okay. Whoop, I missed something. Let's just skip to the end. V'yeter divrei rechavam v'chol asher asa halo hem ktuvim al sefer divrei hayamim l'malchei Yehuda, which is also a book that we don't have. Once again, it's not our divrei hayamim. How do I know this? Because Yerovam, Yirmiyahu wrote this, and Yirmiyahu was before Anshe Knesset Hagdolah who wrote Divrei Hayamim. Okay, so we're not talking about it, but similar to Melchei Yehuda, there was a Melchei Israel, there was a royal annals of the southern kingdom, which we don't have. You want to read about Rechavam, you can go out on some archaeological expedition and find the book, and then you will know what happened. Okay. Umilchama hayta ben Rechavam uven Yerovam kol hayamim. Some Mefarshim say that this is perhaps misprint. It should be Ben Aviam, and it doesn't matter. It means between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. But at this point, throughout their reign, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were at war, according to this milchama. Okay, we don't know. Later, we're going to find out what this war technically means. But even if we don't have the technical details, I want to once again flash forward to our time, say how tragic this is. Okay, we kind of read this and we're like, okay, that's what happened, So they were not friends. We know there was a northern kingdom and southern kingdom, right? But the tragedy, I think, I think that when Achia Shiloni, as God's messenger, told Yerovam, you're getting the northern kingdom because I'm punishing the right? It did not envision, I think, war. It did not have to be. You could be a federation. You could be the United States of Israel or the United Kingdom of Israel, or however you want to call it, right? In which there are two rulers, okay? But everybody is part of the same nation and everybody has the same goals. And if you flash back to Sefer Shoftim, right? The story of Dvorah, right? After the war against Sisera, she blasts the Shvatim who didn't come help, right? Reuven, lama yashafta ben hamishpatayim. Where's Reuven? Reuven is east of the Jordan, right? He's like so east of the Jordan, not his problem, right? People came to the north of Israel. Why should I send my troops there? Why should you send your troops there? The same reason that people from Kiryat Shmona send their people to Gaza, to Miluim, right? It's because we're all part of the same nation, so it doesn't matter where you live. But if you have this sense that we are not part of the same nation, okay, then not only like in Dvorah's time, you're not going to help, but here it's even worse. It's the next step. It's active antagonism. It's our enemies. I'm speaking as a Yehudiya, right? As somebody from Shevet Yehuda. My enemies are Shishak Melech Mitzrayim, and whoever at the time was Melech Edom and Melech Moab and Melech Aram and Melech Israel. These are surrounded by enemies. Okay, and Yehuda. It's really difficult for such a small territorial space to be independent when people are actively against you. We know that today. Okay, but in that case, it was crazy to have this milchama kol yamim. Okay, and then we have the formulaic veishkav rechavam im avotav veikaver im avotav be'ir David V'shem imo Na'ama ha'amonit. That's also, we have in the northern kingdom, we don't hear the mother's names. In the southern kingdom, I think it's part of the way, one of the subtle ways to show that the southern kingdoms are more legitimate is their mothers also get named. Although she was Ammonite, so maybe that's also a point against him, right? She was from Ammon. Vayimloch Aviyam beno tachtav. Okay, so now we have Aviyam, the son of Rechavam, right? Which we had before. We know that because we were skipping back and forth, right? We had Aviyam. I'm sorry. We had Aviyah in the northern kingdom, right? So now we have Aviyah and Aviyam. The names are very, very confusing. Last year, if you want me to send it you again, but last year I sent you a file, right? Two files actually. I sent you with the comparison kings who, right? Good, bad, whatever. So I can look it up again if you want it. If not, you have it. Okay. That's as far as I believe we got last year. So now we should be all cut up. I'll just start unless you have anything to say. If not, I will start up the next parak. Okay, so we will start. Parak Tetvav. Uvishnat Shmona Esrei LaMelech Yerovam ben Navad. We just heard that Aviyam, the son of Rechavam, became king. When was this? When Yerovam ben Navad was already 18 years king in the northern kingdom. Okay, the 18th year of the kingship of Yerovam ben Navad in the north, Malach Aviyam al Yehuda in the south. Shalosh shanim malach b'Yerushalayim v'shem imo Ma'acha bat Avishalom. Fine. Vayelech b'chol chataot aviv asher asa lefanav. Who was his father? Rechavam. Kol chataot aviv. V'lo haya levavo shalem im Hashem Elohav kilevav David aviv. Okay, this right now we're starting the comparison to David as the gold standard. Are you as good as, not as good as? So he was not as good as David aviv. Obviously, he was not as good as David because he went chataot aviv. Ki leman David, because of David, God loved David, at least according to Sefer Melachim and Divrei Yamim. Ki leman David natan Hashem Elohav lo nir b'Yerushalayim la'akim et beno acharav la'amid et Yerushalayim. Because God loved David, God gave David an everlasting dynasty, a promise that his house shall stand forever, and that's why Rechavam became king, and that's now Aviyam, and kings are going to be in Yerushalayim, son after son, more or less, until the end. Asher asa David et hayashar b'nei Hashem, because David did what was right. V'lo sar mikol asher tzivau kol yemei chayav, and he did nothing bad his entire life, except for Uriah Achiti. Okay, except for that little episode where he was an adulterer and a murderer and whatever, but you know, chatati, whatever. Okay, we're gonna start with this next week. And thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very
And
much.
goodbye, all you virtual people.
Virtual people.
Hope to see you in real next week.
Mirz Hashem. Thank
And
you.
Mirz Hashem. Have a good rest of the week.
You too.
You too.
Sarot Tovot.
Amen.
Take care. Thank you.